to be here to talk to you all. Thank you again. So without further ado, if it's okay, I'll share my screen and hopefully it should work. Yeah. Can you cite my screen easily?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. So the title of my talk is very simply called Elements of City Making. And this is a little blurb about me. As mentioned earlier, I am a graduate of the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Ahmedabad, after which I did my urban design degree at University of New South Wales. And I was also a part of the scholarship exchange program, ET at Zurich, while in my undergraduate program. So being in these three universities, obviously, you often find that how design focused we tend to get about looking at our built environment, when really it's part of our experience. And it is something I would like to bring in as a theme of the talk. Also, in terms of my professional experience, I've had 25 years of professional experience, both in Australia, Asia Pacific, and South Asia. And my urban design interests lie in place-based urban design and formulation of qualitative design controls. I casually teach at the University of New South Wales and in Sydney, and have been a course coordinator for the Urban and Regional Design course, the Built Environment and Interdisciplinary Learning that I spoke earlier about. Okay, so today's talk sort of put in a lot of disparate topics, and some of them don't often necessarily sit comfortably, especially when you're talking about, high urban theory. But as I said, I'd make the talk very conversational. And so I will start in terms of what aspects of a place. And while I'm doing that, I again mention that the selection of examples that I have will be Western, but some of it is relevant, some of it is not. But the question is, when we are looking at these case studies, always look at what works and what doesn't in the local context. And also the importance of an evidence-based approach and learning from relevant examples. And the key issues also, when we are looking at city making efforts, is who are the stakeholders? And design is just a part of it, and that design and planning and infrastructure development and engineering, all that goes into making the city, city professionals. Just go and understand the stakeholders better, understand the forces of power and money, and also look at the design and non-design elements of urbanism. So I have gotten some themes of very briefly touching on sustainability, not sustainability just in terms of environmental sustainability, but looking at a broader notion of what is sustainable, whether it is sustainable from an economic, environmental, social, and also the quality of life aspects. And touching very briefly again on the urban infrastructure and resilience of cities as we encounter a climate crisis. Lastly, I have the section which I have cobbled together very short notice, which I've called narrative, which is, I apologize, it may be a tourist point of view because I know very little about Sri Lanka, but I've decided to go ahead and said more to instigate a conversation about how do you see, the city or the precinct that you live around, and where do you see it's heading, and in terms of the narratives that I've sort of outlined. So again, as I said, in terms of the theme of what makes a place successful, I basically have categorized in, as I said, a conversational manner. It is context and character, life on the street, environmental comfort, access and amenity, and lastly, safety. So in terms of context and character, I've used a few words that you often encounter in urban design theory. You would have encountered it, or feel free to go ahead and investigate it. There's a lot of literature around it. One is an appropriate grain and scale of the cities. This is related to the subdivision patterns of the precinct that you're studying. It's important to understand what works, what is that in the rhythm that you see, how wide are the property subdivisions, how does it impact the form? So this is, of course, a very morphological approach of looking at the city, but it's important. This also understanding what is that space that defines the city space, the legible urban room, the street wall that defines these spaces, the importance of heritage and building tradition, the image and sense of place, and most importantly, belonging and identity. Again, I'm touching on a lot of very broad themes, and I'm trying to capture it again using some examples which may or may not be relevant for you, is to use that filter of saying, okay, these themes might work in that context. Does it relate to mine? So this is an example. This is in inner city Sydney. It was an area where these terrace dwellings, pretty much Victorian terrace dwellings, imported from England and sort of modified in a temperate climate, from a cool temperate to a warm temperate climate, and sort of used as a way of city building. These are around, Morganand, you've got your hand up. Do you want me to answer the question now, or do you want to get back later?
No, it was for the early introduction. I put it's all resolved. You go ahead, please.
Okay. So, sorry, you have to apologize because I can't see everyone's hand up. So if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to take it. I might take a little bit of a breather if you want to go ahead and, if you have some questions, I'm happy to be interrupted, in between, and then we can discuss these themes. So again, coming back, the appropriate grain and scale, most of these lots are around 6 to 8 meters, generally 2 to 3 stories, has a very distinctive language, masonry structures, tripartite windows. There's the cornice level, which sort of steps down the hillside. So it sort of creates a pattern. So this is, as I said, is a morphological approach of looking at what is the character of the city. But more importantly, look at the activity on the ground level. The fact that you have, it is a sheltered walkway in the hot Sydney sun. There is that awning which provides the protection. The fact that you have the traffic, very easy for someone to go ahead and pull over, park, go ahead and get your produce and move on. Very different in the subcontinent. There is a very different ethos of retail, etc. But there are certain things that will work universally. And the fact that you have street trees that provide shade is also important. Look at the amount of road surface dedicated to cars, how much is dedicated to pedestrians, cycles, and non-motorized transport. And what have you done to go ahead and encourage certain aspects of, greening and, making civic pride. In this case, a lot of diversity comes in with the manner of the color scheme with these houses. Again, a very, very design-based, but it ties in well with the activity on the ground level. Residential above with shop house type with retail below. The other thing is in terms of the legible urban room and street wall. The example I'm showing you is the Plaza Real in Barcelona. It is a very design space, and it makes references to a lot of the ethos of the city, the Moorish past, with the planting out there, the European classicism in the way the square is designed. I've given a street view link. In the interest of time, we'll not look at it. Feel free to, when I share my presentation, feel free to go and click on these links and visit it yourself. Google has become an invaluable resource in terms of going ahead and doing a lot of armchair travel and your case studies. So this is looking at a space, very simple, with some distinctive landscape, which lends itself to a lot of users. And given the hot, dry climate of Barcelona, acts as a cool air tank, which creates some climatic benefits, as well as at night, it becomes a place for gathering and recreation and a lot more activity. So despite being a very simple planned square, it has a lot of things going for it. And the activities that you find are both the retail and the other programmed activities on the side and the non-programmed stuff in the middle. And if you look at the proportions of it, I did my best to go ahead and get the scale of the square based on Google Maps. You can get the dimensions. And you see the proportion of the street wall to the width of the square. This is the shorter end of the square. And that is around 3:1. So there has been obviously a desire to go and structure the spaces that are important to us. And it's important for you to look at, as I said, these are morphological aspects. So when you are going and proposing something, be conscious of what your actions are when you're proposing something. So it ties in well with activity on the ground level, which is in terms of human behavior. And it has response to the issues of outdoor dining, accommodating tourists, where are the attractors, are there enough places for people to go ahead and, sit? Is there enough free seating? Are there enough toilets? These are aspects to be considered in terms of when you're planning. So you might make the best design places, but if you have to buy a coffee to sit down there and it is not a free space, then is it really truly a public space? And who visits it? Is it accessible to all age groups, etc.? This is an example, probably not very relevant, but looking at when you have heritage and building tradition. This is in Parramatta where I work, and which has some of these older colonial imports, but thereafter there has been a lot of development which are fairly contemporary. So how do you define, how do you tie the old and the new? And are there any things that you might be able to salvage? And there's nothing worse than aping heritage for the sake of it. So sometimes it's important to acknowledge heritage for what it is and see how it fits. So they become effectively places that you go and respect and honor. But to just go ahead and necessarily ape tradition is not a good thing, but it is important to go ahead and make heritage as a part of your brief, any design brief that you are putting in. And in this instance, this is an example of traditional courtyard dwellings in Beijing, the hutongs in Beijing, which have been adapted into other more vibrant areas. So there has been a lot of development pressure in urban centers in China, and these are few examples where these have been retained. They have been modified and gentrified and changed often to an inch of their lives. But it is important that it is acknowledged that those traditional lifestyles are gone. And if you have to retain it, what are the strategies that you bring in place? This is a similar example in Chippendale in New South Wales, where part of a brewery site with some older terraces have been sort of redeveloped, but between the old and the new, they've gone ahead and created, the older terraces have been converted in restaurants. And given the high rents that they generate, it sort of becomes a business case in itself to go ahead and repurposing heritage. Now, this example is not necessarily relevant in the subcontinent. One, we have a lot of heritage, and which one do you save and which you don't? But it is important to understand how the existing heritage can be incorporated in any part of your design brief, because to freeze dry heritage would be very, very difficult. You cannot expect people to continue to use them in the long term as is. Some of them may be repurposed into museums and art galleries, but there's a limit on those. So what do you do with the rest? So it is important to see, and Singapore has quite a few examples where the shop houses have been repurposed, usually through gentrification. And that is the bigger question of social access. So if you gentrify a neighborhood and a heritage neighborhood, bring in upper income groups, where do the existing residents go? So these are complex questions, and you have to keep it in your brief when you're thinking about how do you go ahead and design a precinct or part of the city. The other aspects of context and character, this is a picture from a postcard in the German concession in Tianjin on the eve of World War I. This is China, and looks like a bit of Germany, and it still exists. And of course, these people have gone ahead and said, no, this is important, despite that China stands for something else. But the Tianjin has many such international concessions, and they have been repurposed often as embassy buildings and very high-end executive residences, but they have gone ahead and retained it and said it is something to do with our often very turbulent history, and it has been retained in, with a higher degree of care. And you still get the high rises in the background, as you can see. So it is possible to accommodate, but it should be done carefully. And there are quite a lot of cities in the world. As I said, I do not have too many local examples in the subcontinent, but I think it is important to look at what model worked for them? And is this something that can be repurposed? And there's also a question of what is heritage. And in this instance, in Sydney, it's the Masonic Centre, a brutalist building, and not necessarily loved, but it is a symbol of its time and age. And it is important to acknowledge heritage and build tradition in all its diversity. And it has to be celebrated when you're going ahead and looking at the context and character you're looking for. It shouldn't hark back to the historicist past. It should look at what exists now and what led up to now. And this is an example. I wish I could participate with the students. Where do you think this city is? I don't know if anybody can identify it.
Can that be Russia or?
Yes, you are very close. This is actually in China. Okay. It is St. Sophia's Church in Harbin in China, very close to the Russian border. So our notions of what is, geographic areas, that in Russian influence is so very strong that it is in mainland China as we know it. But it has this distinctive imprint it has left on the culture and tradition of the city. So when you are going and acknowledging what is the built tradition, what is the context and character, be very broad church to include stuff that need not be within your, what you define as heritage, and go ahead and look for things that make it distinctive, because this is what makes it unique in your city. And as I said, it is up to you to go ahead and put those filters on and say, this is relevant. And sometimes it need not be a built tradition. It could be a festival, it could be an event, it could be something that is unique to the place. And your program and your brief should acknowledge that adequately. And the other aspect, this is an example of how, context and character is shaped by a perception, and often films are a very great medium of going and capturing time and space. In this case, The Third Man, Orson Welles. This is, it was very distinctive, and this is turn of, there's interwar Russia that was being depicted in Vienna and very evocatively. So it's understanding how do you imagine your city, and what would you like to showcase it? So is it something that you light the arcades at night and is picking up on this theme, or is there something that you might be able to go ahead and conduct some walking tours for people to understand about it, to know your city better once we are past the pandemic and people can move freely? And of course, as I said, this is something that has been captured very well by film and sometimes by graphic novels, in the case of Tintin, which captures the spirit of the place of early 1900 North Africa as some form of a European colony that's been captured around here by someone's graphic art. Picks up on themes that define a city. You have to be careful that it is not aping tradition or putting on pastiche. And as Durganan mentioned earlier, that it tends to become an obsession with form. And it is essentially often a very Disneyfied or cosmetic creation of cities. And if you go to China, there are many places where they've rebuilt Venice. And if you look at Las Vegas, that's essentially what it is. It's sort of creating the world, the seven wonders of the world in one place. That is not city making, that is a theme park. And you have to be careful that your work does not go ahead and degenerate into that. So look at things that context and character that's relevant to this age. And Asia was really good at going and picking up. This is turn of the century, this early 1900s in either Nanjing or I think this is Nanjing, but it picks up on what the elements of place are, looking at the buntings, the way, the form of transport. Of course, this is done from a very, very colonist perspective and can be offensive to some people to go ahead and reduce to this. But putting that aside, as a graphic artist, he has been very good at capturing what the city spaces are. And without a photograph, somebody drawing it out, it's a good way of going and visualizing your own cities for those who are in the business of going and drawing and creating and visualizing, to see how do you see your city. So we often get these hero shots done by computer generation. They're all very, not they're all, that's too generic a thing, but they often risk being anywhere. So I think context and character has to be related. I think I'm rambling on about it. I do have to move on. And as I said, you have to be very careful so that you are picking up the right elements, otherwise it can generate into pastiche. This is obviously a much hackneyed term, the sense of place, and there has been a seminal book written on it by Christian Norbert-Schulz. Effectively, it started off as a protective spirit of the place, but in Roman religion, in classical Roman religion. And right now it's loosely used as the spirit and character of the place rather than necessarily the guardian spirit. I've included a link, which is quite good in the sense it actually goes ahead and looks at attributes of the sense of place, and I'd encourage you to look at it. So the next is life on the street. And I started off with something that is kind of very impactful, demonstrations. A street is a very public place, and that's where people can express themselves. So this is where fairly significant things happen. It could be, like I've used that picture of Prague, 1989, the Wenceslas Square, and where all the people came out to say, no, they've had enough with, the earlier regime, and they were looking for change. And this gives you an idea of the importance of streets. This is truly public. This is a way where you can express yourself in a democracy and say, that's what it is, peacefully. And streets become a place where you can go and celebrate. This is their city harbor, which is, while not a street, but it becomes one of the largest open spaces in the city, and you have the fireworks, and often 1 million people gather on New Year's Eve to go and celebrate, and this becomes a forum, a stage for celebration, and has been recognized by the City of Sydney as being a huge money earner. And they have gone, once they go up, have a full year program to go ahead and have the stage show, because the amount of tourism and money it generates has become a big deal, and it also puts you up in lights and features the best of you. So it is important when you are creating places to say, can it lend itself to something that everyone enjoys, or it is part of the tradition? Right now, Sydney fireworks starts off the new year because that is very, very visible, and you see it on every footage every New Year. And this is the Shanghai Bund. This is Chinese New Year celebrations. Again, accommodating, where do you get people to be out there, and have you really put in a lot of effort to take care of these massive celebrations? Again, these are pre-COVID images, and I'm sure we'll get there, but it is important to plan for larger events. And the importance of street as a thoroughfare. This is the Shibuya crossing to Tokyo, and this is one of the busiest intersections, but it is where becomes a people moving whenever the cars stop. And this is during the COVID. That's the level of what it became. So this place was defined by the throng of people moving across, and to plan for that. And it is very relevant in Asian countries because of the sheer volume of pedestrian movement. Have you allowed for people to move? And unfortunately, often in the subcontinent, possibly not in Sri Lanka, but in the subcontinent, that is not adequately catered to, that the pedestrian becomes the least important person in a city. So it is important when you're going and designing places, say, where do they stand? Is it comfortable for them? Is it easy for them to walk across? Have you put too many curbs and bumps and hazards and fences, etc., to not really pander to every other person? Is, trucks, cars, trucks, everything has a higher priority than a pedestrian. So do design for the pedestrian. The other thing that works is the importance of lingering and gathering on streets. And this is an example of East Santa Clara, San Jose. And this is an older building that has retail on the ground floor, a whole variety of shops, menswear, restaurants, outdoor dining with the walkway in between. So that allows people to amble along. It also caters to those who are visually challenged to go ahead and use a cane along the side of the street edge. So it caters to people who can sit outdoor and dine. So the waiters cross the footpath and serve on the other side of the street where you see the chairs and tables. So in terms of environmental comfort, that's the other theme that I put in. It is health and quality of life, safety from flood, natural hazards, shade in summer, sun in winter, wind, noise, air quality impacts, the heat island effect, the maintenance of that place, and life environmental impacts. Again, these are keywords I put in. I would maintain it on the long term. Who owns it? Is the city going to own it? Do they have the resources to maintain it? What is a program you have in place for a particular space? You made a great street, but who looks after it? And so there are issues of urban taxation and management, and the question of when you have development, what is the greater good? What is the kind of contribution to the city? So these questions are often not asked in developments. They expected that it'll come off a municipal fund. Municipalities do not have deep pockets. So when you are going ahead, and increasingly in these worlds, that you will find that a lot of open space, there will be a resistance from taking on the management of open space until you plan for how they are going to deliver it care of. As I said, this is not probably for as a part of your immediate brief, but remember that grand projects also need some idea of what's the long-term use of it and who manages and maintains it. This is, of course, a very classical example of the Ramblas in Barcelona, which goes ahead and puts environmental comfort very high on the spectrum. This is a drawing by Alan Jacobs and Great Streets, which looks at putting the pedestrian in the center of the street with adequate shading, with the vehicles on the side as really in service lanes. And it is one of the most distinctive streets, which goes ahead and puts pedestrian and other activity bang in the center. However, its success became a part of its failure because of that recent terrorist attack where people went ahead and drove through that and mowed down people. So in these times and days and times, designs can be manipulated. So you have to look at what works in the context, and how do you go ahead and design these high environmental comfort spaces in your precincts that you're going, really putting together urban design brief, and the solutions can be many. In access and amenity, I talk of the ease of access, the permeability, so that you do not create super blocks. You do not create super blocks, and you have ability for people to have free seating. So there's adequate places for people to lounge and sit without necessarily paying for it. And privately owned spaces require you to privately owned spaces do not allow you to lounge around, and they look at the way, what clothes you wear, and what kind of footwear you wear. So if that is a part of open spaces, it actually excludes a lot of people. And I think you really have to go ahead and create places that are truly public. It does not matter who you come from. Especially in the subcontinent, there are other complications of social stratums who comes in and out, but public place is truly public. Everybody has the right to be there. And that should be the fundamental underpinning of any design that you do. And who affords it, how you do it, there is a relevance for private space, privately occupied space, like outdoor dining, etc. They do go and bring a lot of value, but they should be in reason.
Did we get the Contact lost. Muruganandan, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah. So have you?
Okay. I'll check with Amitabh on the other side and see what's happening.
Yeah.
Till when did you get me? Till when did you hear me?
Yeah, just now. Just now we heard.
The last slide.
This is an example of, a square to the left. This was a square in Parramatta. This area was quite blighted and I had a
You would
lot
need
of
to reshare.
instances. Oh,
You would
sorry.
need to reshare the
Okay.
presentation.
Okay, I'll do that. Just give me a minute. Sorry about that. The internet has been a bit spotty, so just give me a minute. Can you see me now? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes.
It is
Okay.
fine.
Yeah. So again, in terms of access amenity, these two examples that I've shown are both in Sydney. One is in Parramatta where I work, and Blighted Square with a lot of petty crime, etc. So just by creating a higher quality environment, very simple finishes that's easy to maintain. There's trees, shading, and some free seating and furniture. It did go ahead and attract a lot of people, and there was enough active surveillance, and the place became safer. And higher profile shops and eateries started coming in. As I said, it's very different in case of the subcontinent. Our development pressures are very different, but I think it's important to look at what do you need to do in order to often change the image of a place. And often it is doing very basic stuff, not necessarily invest a huge amount of money. The other that you see is a water park that was created in lieu of, this is a development contribution of a bank building at the back, created a very state-of-the-art water park for children to play in, and gave enough opportunities for the parents to hang around, get a cup of coffee while the children played in that water park in the middle of that court. So looking at opportunities where you can have the public partnership to create and deliver these projects. Just give me a minute. Okay. So this is, I'm sure you have encountered the topic of crime prevention through environmental design, CEPTED for short. And the idea is, this was done with work in the 1970s in America, where they looked at what are the stratagems that you could put in order to go ahead and reduce crime by having more surveillance, people looking out and actually saying, if their eyes are it is essentially safe. Now, in more denser environment in Asia, this is probably not as much an issue, but that being said, the way we are urbanizing and the building forms we are creating and gated estates, etc., we seem to be going ahead and picking up not necessarily the best examples of the West in terms of urbanizing our cities. So it is important to create cities which have the traditional surveillance, that you have people on the street who can watch people do stuff. So if something goes wrong, there are people to go ahead and help or report it or make sure that the place becomes safe, especially in residential areas and neighborhoods and where there are children about, etc. So that makes for safer places. As I said, the Asian case is a bit different. There is less of this stranger danger perspective, and given the low densities in the West, one of the products of low density is also lack of safety. There are two ways of dealing with it: is you make it a state and put in a lot of surveillance, or you go ahead and design cities that allow this naturally. So again, summarizing what makes a place successful: context and character, life on the street, environmental comfort, access and amenity, and safety. How am I doing for time? I think I have been speaking for half an hour. Do you want me to continue?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So I might just skip over the CEPTED bit because it is very, very specific to, safety and looking at what makes for safer spaces, and they're self-explanatory in terms of making sure they're distinctive, clear entrances. One thing I'd like to mention, which is often mentioned in architecture school, or semi-public space. Do not have anything called a semi-public space. It's either private or public. You may have a yard that is something that you might actually share it as a landscape asset, but anything that has lack of clarity in terms of ownership is likely going to be either squatted on or abused. So do create spaces that allow that, that buffer, but a piece of development, at least an urban element, has to be owned by somebody. If it does not have any definition of what works and what doesn't, who owns what, that is a recipe for disaster. It should be very clear what is owned by the public, what is owned by the private. The moment it's owned by someone private, then the sense of territoriality comes in. You put a fence, whatever it is, you go and protect it. But then there is less of a chance of that being occupied and abused for other stuff. Now, in the subcontinent, that tends to become contested space. You have the informal sector. So you have a lot of people on the streets, on push carts, etc. Where do they go? Now that needs a little bit of thinking. Singapore had come up with some strategies which are quite radical, going and putting them in multi-story decks. But does that really work? So, but I think it's important to look at safety from that perspective. And as I said, I will not go too much into it. The other thing is designing places with opportunities, eyes on the street is important. And other thing is having a mix of demography, better safety. Okay. The next is blank street walls, core image and isolation, and the importance of CCTV in the future to come, because natural surveillance is not quite cutting it. So you will find cities relying heavily on CCTV for safety and security. And this is in the city of Shoreditch in London. And this level of surveillance is going to be quite commonplace, which does bring in the issue of how much surveillance do you want? And is there a way of running cities that have surveillance built in rather than actual surveillance and invading privacy? Importance of appropriate night lighting, using activity supports. I'll go to night lighting again. Brighter lit spaces tend to be safer at night. Looking at activity support when you have large areas which are unsurveilled, looking at putting in support users where you can go and buy a bus ticket or something. There are people on streets seeing who is going around. Again, this is probably be more of a Western criteria, but the way we are urbanizing and creating suburbs, middle-class suburbs, this might become a requirement soon. Lastly is access. One is social access. The Bryant Park in front of New York Public Library, where they provided this free seating and completely changed the nature of the park. So you had a whole group of people, the homeless, young people hanging around, people borrowing a book from the library and reading it in the sun. And it used to be otherwise act of allowing people to sit down, completely changed it. The other issue is barrier-free access. So you have to find architects who love to put steps everywhere, but it also means that people on wheelchairs have difficulty around. So change your design briefs to go and see how does everyone get around. And importance for pedestrians. And this is the Times Square, New York, where they decided to close some street and basically using a paint on the ground. And this is a new place you can hang around. And by shutting the street, they actually found it did improve traffic circulation in certain ways. And a lot more land was allowed to go back into pedestrian territory. Singapore made a concerted effort to go ahead and allow for barrier-free access, at least on one side of the road. And I think they're going through the process of making that entire street accessible. And if you notice on one side, you find a lot of the ramps, etc. The others are still have a lot of steps, but I think they're incrementally retroactively fitting out so that it becomes accessible to all. This is an example in Sydney in King Street Wharf, where there was a grade change of 6 meters that they basically used a combination of steps and ramps that allowed both things to happen. So it's just by changing your design brief a little, you get the same out, necessarily excluding. Lastly, in terms of perception and activation of a place, this is Merton's premise on what distance do you need in order to go and perceive a particular building. And they went ahead and looked at the proportion of where you've seen a building or a masonry building of its time. This was done in 1880 and used optical techniques to go and define what was the best vantage point to see a particular place. We're saying if you're as far as the height of the building, a masonry building 8 to 9 stories high, that's where you can perceive the building in all its glory. And if you have to step it twice as far, you get to see the bigger context. And further away, 3 times as far, you get to see even more, and 4 times you get a more panoramic vision. And this is important in the way you design the scale of spaces and what do you get to see. So it's the social field of vision. So you're designing for people on one hand, the close interaction. And this is Jan Gehl's study that went into looking at how people interact and how the Danes have actually picked it up and used it as a part of a lot of the place strategies. As I said, I'll skip along, and it has some theory embedded in it in terms of activation, looking at how do you put these blank walls, etc. How many doors per 100 meters do you put in to get the better levels of activation? Some probably some rules about European cities and how activate. It's a bit different in the continent. So I would ask you to use your own filters in coming up with these standards. So I've already spoken of Glebe Point Road, and then there are a few examples I had of this example I picked up, and I said, okay, this is an example of California, an active street. And I did a little bit of Google research to find out where is this place. And I figured out that was a block it was located in. This is what it looks like using the Merton's problem and an aerial view. That's what it looks like. So often a perception of the street is very different from the bird that you usually see in an urban design presentation. So it's important to go and relate to what happened on the street. And this is again another one, Santa Clara. That is the building it is located in, and this is the block study. So it is often very different to what we believe our experience on the street is. So it's important to design from a pedestrian point of view. And you do get these tall towers and landmark buildings, and you'd find a lot of the development communities say, my building is the landmark one. So according to that, every development is a landmark. Landmark is not about buildings, it's often about spaces and often about not having buildings, or it could be an open space, it could be what people see, and keep that in mind in terms of, because right now the focus about making cities seems to be a monoculture of towers. And towers are important. It is needed to accommodate a lot of growth in cities, but it isn't the only model. And it's important to look at what is experience from the street. What does it do? Does it allow enough light and breeze and the heat island effects and other things? So one of the things that you have to look about activation is about, if you want a street that works well, it should be affordable for the retailers to occupy it. So if it is really high rents, what it does, it creates very high-end shopping centers, and it excludes a lot of people. So a high street that works well is to have a range of users. So you have right from the high end to the middle end, and also some smaller shops. So that's where the second and tertiary streets are important. The primary streets have the higher retail addresses. The secondary streets have the less, more so, but the smaller lanes and finer grain development. That's why the importance of these fine streets are important, because then you can have some smaller retailer on the back streets and you can still be in close walk from the main streets. So right now, of course, because our focus is on traffic movement, so it has everything is loaded up onto the movement corridors, and therefore both the formal, informal, and other streets go and locate them there. So it's important to look at opportunities for this range of businesses to happen. And sometimes cities do need to think creatively that, you should be able to subsidize rent in the areas to go ahead and allow the other things to work. I don't know how much of a reality is this works out. I think real estate is something that tends to be regulated very differently all over the world. So it is important to keep in mind that if you are creating a spanking new building, it also means that the retail tenancies on the ground floor that you're hoping to activate is going to be very high. And you only have car showrooms, which really do not activate the street. You do not have people coming in and buying a car every day, as opposed to a cup of coffee or something small or a pencil or a bottle of milk. So think in terms of regulating size of retail if you're coming up with controls, limiting superstores with catchments for diversity. Paris does it very well. They have 1,000 square meter limit and also require you to keep fresh food. Look at, as I mentioned, incentivizing access to fresh food locally. Will gently, very briefly touch on sustainability and not only environmental sustainability or fiscal sustainability, also look at how does point of view and also the quality of life that it generates. So there's a lot of literature and defining of quality of life. I think it's important for you to go ahead and use a little bit of a critical eye to what is mentioned. Sometimes they are written from a very, very Western perspective, defining what is a livable city. And I think it's important to understand what your assets are and how do you acknowledge and celebrate it. And just a minute. So in terms of social sustainability, looking at opportunities of how you provide local community infrastructure, schools, libraries, parks and playing fields, to making sure that is included as part of your brief, adequate to the volume of density, etc., that you're considering. Diversity and social justice, looking at key worker housing, so people like nurses and firemen and policemen, etc., service precincts, often with real estate rents being very high. They have to travel very far out of the city to come in. And that is unfair, that you cannot expect the city to work unless you allow for key worker housing. Looking at affordable housing for people who cannot necessarily afford. So by creating these pockets of super high rises, you often take out people and also the support workers that go into every city. And lastly, looking at student and senior housing as the population ages. Asia still does not have that problem equally, but it is an issue that you have to consider. The importance of arts and culture, looking at creative districts, pop-up installations, looking at startup and incubator hubs. And lastly, looking at the quality of life. And as I said, these are very broad measures to keep in mind rather than necessarily plan your city around. Physical and mental well-being, access to education, access to housing, employment, etc. So if we keep our design briefs to a very cosmetic things, these don't matter. But in order for our cities to work well, these are something that you look at it. And it does not come from a political point of view. If you don't do it, irrespective of whatever your political persuasion, there comes a crunch in a city's life. So this has to be planned in. In terms of energy, so environmental sustainability, looking at issues of energy, water, and waste, planning for it, and listening to stakeholders in the development of your brief on how do you go ahead and manage that. Are you looking at water reticulation, recycled water, looking at rainwater harvesting and planning for climate change resilience, and looking at how do you minimize the lifetime energy content and carbon neutrality. There is a lot of work on it, and in energy poor nations, and a lot of the countries in the subcontinent are energy poor. So looking at what natural resources you have that you could effectively use, whether when I was studying, it was all about passive solar housing, etc. And I think we are beyond that point. We probably need to look at more active engagement of technology to go ahead and meet energy needs. Lastly, looking at from the fiscal sustainability point, looking at business efficiency, identifying who your stakeholders are, having transparency and clarity in business decisions and incentives for investors, and looking at productivity. Like if you have improved standards of living, it will go ahead and generate other benefits. And as I mentioned before, the equitable distribution of wealth, it's not the role of an urban designer or a planner, etc. But if you keep that in your brief, every time a design brief is prepared, you do not have a monoculture of users or monoculture of demography that you're catering to, that you think, how's this building or this precinct work? So you really have to look at a slightly more macro element. And this is a slide I put in for my project construction managers who are saying, I have to do it in time and cost. I said, look, step aside, come up with a brief that goes ahead and looks at the bigger functioning of how your precinct fits into the city. So rather than it just becomes a short-term gain, look at the long-term, how it works out. And the balance long and short-term profit perspective, and looking at reinvestment in the city. Like, for example, classic example, the city of Agra, it has one of the highest volumes of tourists coming in to see the Taj Mahal, but very little of it is invested back in the city. And it is in a dire condition compared to a lot of other Indian cities. And you have to go ahead and look at how do you go ahead and fund some of that benefit back into the city. And lastly, corporate social responsibility. Urban infrastructure, a few examples of this is La Défense in Paris. It was created as CBD of Paris that was outside the end of the Champs-Élysées. It was really designed with a lot of pomp, and one of Mitterrand's one of the grand projects that he did. But one of the things in order to go ahead and have the amount of floor space and the office job workers and access, etc., did create a fairly placeless area, which is very void of people, and it has these grand gestures, but it is not the city that downtown Paris is like. So it's important to create capacity to attract investors, but also make sure that you're creating places for people. This was one better example, the Grand Project in Paris, the Grand Project Express, which is using a metro ring. It's around a $200 billion project, a billion euro project, or creating a network of metro stations around an orbital around Paris, and looking at the towns and cities around that are impacted by it and creating more people-friendly spaces. So this is where large injections from a national or a state level can make a difference. And in this case, this is the Stade de France in Saint-Denis, which was a kickstart. The World Cup was held there. They went in a lot of major cash injection, which was a really rundown area of Paris. And they did manage to go ahead and improve the urban and amenity and quality of life there. And in certain instances, events like the Olympic, the Sydney Olympic had an environment theme. A contaminated wasteland was made into a showcase to be demonstrated to the world. Normally, you don't need to do it. Elephants, Sydney all Olympics are literally white elephants nowadays, never cost neutral, and you spend more money, but it is done more for going and kickstarting these large urban infrastructure projects, because that allows the government to go and invest. London had the same thing, where it did go ahead and invest in former industrial, with production being outsourced elsewhere. These were often fallow lands and they were redeveloped. So looking at the opportunity, And this is an example I put in a development in Sydney, which the developers went ahead and were required to put in a bridge. But as a result of that, it went ahead and created an enormous amount of 2,000 more dwellings in order to afford the bridge. So this is something you have to keep in mind, that private sector developers are not in the business of nation building. You have to keep in mind that you really have to go ahead and let an infrastructure policy that is independent of small petty interests or development. Let the developers do their job, let them build their buildings. But when it comes to large infrastructure, it does need a bigger infrastructure strategy. Also planning for flood resilience. I don't know how acute it is in Sri Lanka. I imagine in and around your case study areas, I would imagine being coastal areas, there would be some impacts. This is an example in Sydney, which is in a flood basin. And that is what is the impact of not planning for flood. So in this case, of course, they have planned for flood, but the retail edge is nearly 1.5 meters above the ground. Accessibility is impacted. A substation can short if the water level goes up. There are issues with emergency evacuation in case of flooding. And there is higher insurance premium because of the increased risk of flood. So this is something, it might be a first world problem, but this is going to impact a lot of the inner city urbanizing areas that are using similar models of development. So this is something you have to plan for, and importance of having a more comprehensive flood management strategy as part of your briefs earlier upfront. City of Helsinki has already introduced some guides on prevention control of floods. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is planning for heat resilience. As you put in higher and taller buildings, the generated heat that gets trapped in. Looking at opportunities of increasing urban tree canopy, shading and passive energy techniques, putting cool roofs and materials, and green roofs and walls where relevant. But these green roofs and walls are very expensive measures. So often by planting a tree, you manage to go and mitigate a lot of the issues. So allow space for trees to grow in your cities. Heat resilience is a topic that you have to keep in mind, and it is impacting a lot of cities all over the world. And also planning for urban resilience. Singapore Master Plan is one of the best examples in the sense they've kept to it since 1959. And the problem with a lot of the world is that master plans are made and shunned. And I think having a bigger plan that you stick to is very important for the well-being of a city. And Singapore has decided to invest in water management. It is poor in terms of potable water. So they've gone in and thrown the whole effort in effectively creating capacity. So the weir that you see at the end, at the top of the page, next to the Marina water barrage, it effectively captures all the freshwater flows and becomes a freshwater resource by effectively pumping out all the salt water, gathering all the rainwater for a decade or so, and basically creating a potable water resource within the city. Otherwise, piped water would have to be brought in from Malaysia. So planning for it at a national level, in this case, it's a city-state, so it probably has some relevance to urban design. So now that I've done that, I will, this is, as I, my view as a tourist, I just wanted to put in these themes that you need to look at in terms of the narrative. And I did a very, very quick summary of what I could find, with a very quick capture, trawling the net. This was a study done by the Cornell University, which basically looked at the traditional vernacular narratives. The thatched rural dwellings, all of us do these in our first years, capturing what is a sense of the village form in our environments. And then, of course, you have, this goes into the vernacular narrative, looking at analysis. It is from a very design-centric point of view, looking at sacred, the profane. These are important aspects. But The other modern vernacular narrative is often very much more prosaic. It tends to be about functionality. It's looking at how do you go and work with the land and what are the briefs that you have. And sometimes in this peri-urban area, it's quite green and lush and quite okay. But it also has in the subcontinent a lot of instances where you have slums and over-densification, etc. So that is something you have to keep in mind. So what are the narratives that is of significance? What do you take home from these the information that you get? The other is the colonial narrative that you get. And they nowadays have been either, there is a love-hate relationship, often about the colonization not being good, or it could be heritage. So having an understanding of how does it work in the current context. And also in terms of the design trends, the modern architectural narrative, often they are buildings in space, or they're contained courtyards, and the engagement with the street or the public spaces is very limited. They often tend to be a Palladian villa surrounded by a garden and very high levels of greenery shrouding it. But that is a fairly anti-urban approach. If you really look on the streets, our experiences are very different. And I think that is important to go ahead and address. Then there's the global narrative of going ahead and making a mark to say we have arrived, and putting in a lot of towers and making an amazing skylight and lighting. And I found these two imageries that I found was kind of very distinctive, of going ahead and saying, and it is not unique to Colombo, I'm just use Colombo around here, but every city is there out there to brand itself and say, put in a marker and say, we have arrived. And a lot of the time becomes this, it becomes a city that does not necessarily belong anywhere. It could be anywhere. And this is a visualization done for the Colombo Port City, but this is not unique to this instance. It is there for every urban design master plan presentation you see. They all come up with the same. So how do you go ahead and, go back to that earlier context and character and all the other themes? How do you tie it in? For me, I've just gone ahead, again, it's a tourist point of view, and I ask you to forgive me, of looking at the contemporary narrative. And I find Google Street Maps are really good because it shows you life on the street as it is, not with the filters of 3D, renderings, but really it actually shows the issues that are on the ground. And this is one example. This is to the east of that. It's somewhere to the east of the screen, where that little shrine is marked to the top right-hand corner of the page. And that's where this is located. And it shows you what is on the ground. And it shows you that there are instances, there's a newspaper seller, there's street lights, there's a pedestrian crossing, there is some older buildings, there's a new one going on. And there is also another further down this, on the western end of the city, this is going on. And I think it's important to realize, where are the people here? This might be a time where people are not walking around, but I think both of them tend to be within a kilometer of each other, and they're very, very different. And why so? And I think it's important for you to go and understand, when you're designing in your precincts, about how do you create these places of people. So again,